A bold move by a potential 2016 presidential candidate could impact federal voting rights for thousands. Elroy Saylor, co-founder of J.C. Watts and Associates, joins us to talk about Kentucky Senator Rand Paul's fight for felons. Good to have you back. We always love to have you here on DC Breakdown. How you doing, my friend?
I can't complain one bit. Went to see the boss, Diana Ross, last night.
No, how was it?
Oh, she is just amazing.
Oh.
You know, if you're going to be a diva, that's the way to do it.
Like,
do it right.
Do it right.
Do it right.
All right. A little Diana Ross conversation before we get to Senator Rand Paul. I love it. I love it. Let's talk about Senator Paul.
Sure.
He has been someone who has been willing to think out of the box, not just think out of the box, but actually take action and do things that are out of the box. He's been to Howard University. He's been all over the United States trying to engage African Americans. And this doesn't feel phony to me. This feels like someone who really understands America and wants to have access to different types of people and wants them to hear his message. And maybe you don't cotton to his message, but who knows? Maybe you will. Ask Thad Cochran.
Well, you know, thanks for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to be back on. Senator Rand Paul has been really working on a piece of legislation that's near and dear to my heart, as well as I'm probably sure most Americans. As you realize, 5.8, I believe it's 5.85 million Americans are presently without their rights to vote in America because of federal convictions. There are 3 states that permanently ban it. I believe it's Florida, Iowa, and Kentucky. So the senator is really taking this issue up. You know, when you look at his home state alone, if you're a prisoner, you can't get your rights to vote back. And when you start talking about just the decline of America, whether it's economically, whether it's socially, whether it's morally, one of the things we've got to do as Americans is make sure we put that family back together. And one of the ways to put that family back together is to make sure that men and women who have gone on, and I say made a mistake in life, or I'm sorry, not to say made a mistake, but made a choice that was the wrong choice. They have now gone and paid their restitution, they've done their probation, and whatever else they've had to do to serve their time. You know, we ought to think about giving them their rights to vote back.
And I know the senator actually went back to his home state of Kentucky to deal with the state legislature there with respect to voting in this issue, and didn't have any luck there. And so he said, I'm going to bring the fight then back to the federal level. So what this would do, because I know he's introduced a bill that would restore the rights to those felons that were convicted of a nonviolent crime. This would really expand the voting rolls. And as he said, that's a good thing. I'm a politician. I want people to be able to vote. It's that simple. It makes sense.
You know, we're going to send our men and women and young boys and girls over to Iraq to defend freedom and voting rights and transparency and things of that nature. Then by golly, you know, we ought to make sure that every American has the right to vote. You know, when you start talking about, some people will call it conservative principles, well, I just call it kind of common sense principles. You know, there's no better way to, you know, make sure that the family is strong. There's no better way to make sure that we have more taxpayers in America, not more taxes, but more taxpayers. I was at a session a couple weeks ago, and there was a young man from D.C., pretty interesting story. He had served time, 10 or 15 years. He had completed his probation, completed his restitution, and he wanted to reestablish himself as a father with his son. I don't believe he was still with the young lady, but he wanted to reestablish himself with the father. And because of some of the voting rights laws, I'm sorry, he was in Maryland, because of some of the voting right laws, he could not take his son to the DC National Zoo because of this conviction. Can you imagine that? You know, you haven't seen your son in 10 to 12 years. You go back, you want to, you know, reestablish yourself as the man of your house, as the father of your child, and just get back in life.
Time,
served your time. You know, you paid your restitution. Trying to start your life over, and now you can't. You know, now, so what does that do to that boy and that father when he can't spend time to chaperone his son on a field trip?
That's not providing what's needed for the family to thrive.
So, you know, when we start talking about the federal government, and it's interesting because a lot of people will say, oh, Republicans or Democrats or people are just doing this to get votes. But if you talk about Rand Paul and his ideology, first you look at his home state. It's permanently there that you can't get your rights back. So it's a constituent issue for him, one. 2, it fits right into this bigger issue that a lot of Republicans focus on when we talk about big government. You know, you talk about overreaching with the federal government. Well, that's the criminal justice system really overreaching. And if you recall, there was a great bipartisan effort with welfare reform at a point you know, in America after 1936, we had FDR, we had the New Deal, and we had all these different entitlement programs to help lift the people out of poverty. Well, they had great intentions, but over time, we needed to go back in and look at our welfare system and say, how do we make it better? How do we make tweaks? I
want to quote Rand Paul here because it's an important quote. There is a racial outcome to the war on drugs. 3 out of 4 people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses are black or brown, and brown. White kids are using drugs at the same rate black kids are. And so, you know, yeah, he's right, except they're not in prison disproportionately. We are. So, you know, this move that he's made, there's a Democrat in Congress, Ben Cardin of Maryland, who's looking, you know, it looks like they can partner. Now, Ben wants voting rights for everyone who's serving, but there is now a bipartisan effort, there could be, to bring more rights to felons, people who have served their time, who've paid their dues, and who need to be matriculated back into society in a way that is going to be good for everyone.
Yes. Well, you know, like I said, I take my hat off. You look at welfare reform, it was a bipartisan Congress. Bill Clinton was in the White House. Republicans were in control of the House and the Senate. And they got together and they said we needed to fix welfare reform. It was a great program when it started. It needed to be retweaked, and there were unintended consequences. I think you have the same thing with the criminal justice system. Government that's gotten too big, over-criminalization, started off as a great effort to say, well, hey, how do we deal with people who are, you know, bad apples in society? But now, 20, 30 years later, I think you need to go back in and you need to say, well, what are the consequences of that? So I take my hat off to both Senator Cardin and Senator Paul to say, hey, let's get together. You know, Cardin starts here, Senator Paul starts here, but eventually you get back to the middle. So
Elroy
he's doing some good stuff.
Co-founder of J.C. Watson Associates. Brother, always good to have you on the show.
Me. I appreciate it.
And tell Rand Paul we said hi and we'd like to have him on the show.
We sure will.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.